Lecture 3. Now we are heading out to sea. Not only did we embark suddenly, without warning. We have already come a long way, or so it would seem, and we are already in uncharted waters. It is time to take our bearings in order better to know where we have come from and where we are going. But first, we must work out how far we have come. We are still steering towards the question, what about philosophy? I say what about, instead of what is. To satisfy certain philosophers who are irritated beyond measure by the question what is. But these are intra-philosophical matters, and I will not bore you with the details. We have been hugging the shores of the history of the sciences as closely as possible. Why this cruise along the scientific shores? Because we thought we could advance the thesis that the relationship with the sciences constitutes what is specific to philosophy. Remember, its specific determinant, not its determinant in the last instance. It is this thesis that we are attempting to justify. It was to this end that we took a look at what occurs in what seemed to us a privileged, because revealing, experience, or even experiment, of what is known as a crisis in the sciences. And from this we drew a certain number of conclusions that are undoubtedly difficult for our scientific friends to accept. We hit them with the revelation that they have always been affected by a spontaneous philosophy of scientists, even when they were not wearing the historical hat of the great scientist philosophers who, believing themselves assigned to a historical mission unprecedented in the history of philosophy, are simply chewing over, like hard-working but ingenious subordinates, the leftovers of an old philosophical meal which the ideological contradictions of the epoch made dominant and obligatory. By inflicting this revelation on them we have undoubtedly fallen foul of their convictions, their honesty, even if it is cloaked in a certain naivety. After all, to replace one cartoon image with another, whilst we recognized that philosophers are ridiculous characters who fall into wells and drew conclusions from this, scientists are well aware that even if they do not fall in their disciplines as philosophers do in theirs, they do not always have their feet on the ground, but rather a certain naivety in their heads. It is time to step back from this experience. If they examine these conclusions from a safe distance, our scientific friends will find that things fall into place, and that we will render them the justice they may fear we are denying them. From this distance, what are we to retain of our analysis of the phenomena that the crises of the sciences reveal? Two discoveries. Two themes of the utmost importance. 1. There is such a thing as the exploitation of the sciences by philosophy. 2. There is within the consciousness or the unconscious of scientists such a thing as a spontaneous philosophy of scientists, SPS. I will now take up these 2 points. The exploitation of the sciences by philosophy. More precisely, the vast majority of philosophies have always exploited the sciences for apologetic ends extrinsic to the interests of scientific practice. Note well, I am saying nothing new. I am merely taking up a theme that was evoked in relation to the crisis of the sciences, specifically, when I spoke of the reaction of the second type of scientist, the spiritualists who turn the failure of science ad majorem Dei gloriam, as they do all human misery and suffering. But in taking up this theme, I will generalize it. And to give it its general meaning, I am obliged to say, The vast majority of known philosophies have, throughout the history of philosophy, always exploited the sciences, and not simply their failures, to the profit of the values, a provisional term, of practical ideologies, religious, moral, juridical, aesthetic, political, etc. This is one of the essential characteristics of idealism. If this proposition is true, it must be capable of being concretely illustrated, and this is the case. I believe there is no need to dwell at length on the example of religious philosophies, dominated by religious ideology. All the scientific genius of Pascal did not prevent him from deriving beautifully eloquent flourishes of rhetoric, dedicated to the slightly heretical Christianity he professed, from the contradictions of the mathematical infinite itself, and from the religious terror inspired in him by the new, Galilean, infinite spaces of the world, of which man was no longer the center and from which God was absent, which made it necessary, in order to save the very idea of God, to say that he was in essence a hidden God, because he was no longer anywhere to be found, neither in the world, nor in its order, nor its morality. One can only wait to be touched by his unpredictable and impenetrable grace. I say, all the genius of Pascal, for he was a very great scientist and, what is extremely rare, a paradox that must be pondered, an astonishing, almost materialist, philosopher of scientific practice. But he was too alone in his time, and like everyone else was subject to such contradictions, such stakes and such a balance of power. Think of the violence of his struggle against the Jesuits, that he could not avoid the obligatory solution, which was also no doubt a consolation to him, of resolving in religion, his own, the most general and conflict-ridden contradictions of a science in which he labored as a genuine materialist practitioner. And so, together with some admirable texts, on mathematics, on scientific experimentation, Pascal left us the corpus of a religious philosophy of which it must be said that its inspiration is the exploitation of the great theoretical contradictions of the sciences of his time to apologetic ends external to the sciences. Next to a giant like Pascal, what is to be said in our time of a Taylor? The same thing, but without being able to find anything in his work to counterbalance the vacuous and deluded enterprise of a paleontologist dressed in a cassock who prides himself on being a priest as he draws risky conclusions from his science, open exploitation for the sake of heaven above. The case of spiritualist philosophies is a little more complex. They do not have the disconcerting, even moving, simplicity of certain religious philosophies. They are more cunning, for they do not pursue their ends directly but make a detour through the philosophical categories elaborated in the history of philosophy: spirit, soul, freedom, the good, the beautiful, values, etc. And because at this point I bring the history of philosophy to bear, note well that all the philosophies of which we are speaking are still contemporary. We still have among us representatives of religious philosophy, spiritualist philosophy, idealist critical philosophy, neo-positivism, materialism, etc. But these philosophies do not share the same date of birth and most have not always existed. New philosophies have appeared in opposition to the older ones, they have prevailed over them in historical struggle. But the characteristic feature of this singular history of philosophy is that the new philosophy that prevails over an older one, which it comes to dominate after a long and difficult struggle, does not destroy the older one, which lives on beneath this domination and thus survives indefinitely, most often. in a subordinate role, but sometimes recalled by the conjuncture to the front of the stage. If this is the case, it is because the history of philosophy proceeds very differently from the history of the sciences. In the history of the sciences, a double process is constantly in play: the process of the pure and simple elimination of errors, which disappeared totally, and the process of the reinscription of earlier theoretical elements and knowledges in the context of newly acquired knowledges and newly constructed theories. In sum, a double dialectic: the total elimination of errors and the integration of earlier findings, still valid but transformed, into the theoretical system of the new insights. The history of philosophy proceeds very differently, via a struggle for domination by the new philosophical forms against those that were once dominant. The history of philosophy is a struggle between tendencies realized in philosophical formations, and it is always a struggle for domination. But the paradox is that this struggle results only in the replacement of one domination by another, and not in the pure and simple elimination of a past formation, as error. For there is no error in philosophy, in the sense that there is in the sciences, that is, of the adversary. The adversary is never totally defeated and therefore never totally suppressed, totally erased from historical existence. It is only dominated, and it lives on under the domination of the new philosophical formation that has overcome it after a very protracted battle. It lives on as a dominated philosophical formation, and is naturally ready to re-emerge whenever the conjuncture gives the signal and furnishes the occasion. These remarks were of course necessary to give the real meaning of our analysis of the different philosophical formations that we are examining. It is not a question of simply enumerating philosophies, asking why they exist or subsist alongside one another, but rather of examining the philosophical formations which, old as they may be, still exist today in subordinate but still living forms, dominated by other formations which have conquered in struggle, or are in the process of conquering, something that must be called power. I will now return to spiritualist philosophies. Not to give their date of birth, but to show that they were dominant throughout the entire period that preceded the establishment of bourgeois relations, to say nothing of their roots in antiquity, under feudalism, in the Middle Ages, only to be dominated subsequently by bourgeois idealist philosophy, from which they did not fail to take some of their own arguments, divorced from their classical idealist meanings. There is thus, as we shall see, a spiritualist interpretation of Descartes, Kant, Husserl, etc. What distinguishes spiritualist philosophies from overtly religious philosophies is that they do not directly exploit the sciences, to speak only of what concerns us now, to the profit of overtly religious themes, ad majorem Dei gloriam. They too may well pronounce the name of God, but it is the God of the philosophers, a philosophical category. They exploit the sciences for the profit of the human spirit, of human freedom, of human moral values, etc., or, bringing all these themes together, to the profit of the freedom of the human spirit which, as everyone knows, is manifested in creation, be it scientific, moral, social, aesthetic, or even religious. All philosophers know this. But not only philosophers, for these philosophical themes, which famous academics have enshrined in immortal works, and as nothing ever completely dies in philosophy, they do stand a chance of becoming immortal, have passed into the vulgar language of political speeches, sermons, magazine articles, in short, have ended up where all philosophy normally ends, in everyday life, to furnish arguments to justify the practical stands taken by these gentlemen. Have we not heard enough about the supplement Dame Bergson, which our mechanical civilization, see Duhamel to the first, and now our consumer society, seems to need? From the supplement Dame to the quality of life, the way is short and direct. Surely we heard enough about the freedom of the spirit, of culture, of the creative power of the human mind, of the great, moral values that justify the existence and the defense of our civilization, which is, apparently, not simply an organization of production, industrial societies, but a soul which, of course, struggles as best it can against the intrusions of matter, yet remains what it always has been, a soul which, naturally enough, must be saved and defended, against whom? Against an intrusive materialism? Which one? The materialism that speaks of mechanized matter? That poses no real threat, if we use the standard of living and participation to improve the quality of life, we will get by. But the other materialism of political materialists united in struggle poses a very different kind of threat. If we leave these lower regions to ascend to the heights of our spiritualist philosophers, we will easily begin to see how their thought is constructed. Bergson's whole career as a spiritualist was based upon the exploitation of the difficulties, or, in the sense that we have discussed it, of the crisis in the theory of cerebral localizations, matter and memory squared, as well as modern physics, relativity, and Durkheimian sociology, the two sources of morality and religion cubed. Pretexts for developing, in a multitude of forms and in a vocabulary renovated to the profit of spirit, the antagonism between material, space and spiritual duration. A singular destiny, at the very moment of the return to Kant that gave birth to the different forms of neo-criticism, Bergson chose another way. He knew almost nothing about Kant, and if he did read Kant, he understood him badly because he did not want to understand him. Bergson works the old spiritualist vein and exploits the sciences in a spiritualist mode, supplemented with new arguments and new categories, intuition, l'amavant, spiritual energy, etc. The mode is different, the result the same. Brunswick, who, like Bergson, but at a higher level, wielded real autocratic ideological power in the university, is apparently something else. A great mind, at least as far as the history of modern French philosophy is concerned, who spoke incessantly of spirit. The fact that he came to a miserable end in an occupied France whose government hunted down the Jews changes nothing of his official past. This man, who read Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, possessed an impressive culture, historical, unlike Bergson, and scientific, albeit only second-hand. And this man seemed to belong to the great critical idealist tradition since, in his eyes, everything was contained in Kant and Fichte, so much so that he thought Aristotle and Hegel retarded the mental age of a 12-year-old. Brunswick, Kantian and critical thinker? That would be going too far. It is true that when he read Descartes, he never stopped relating him to Kant. But he read Kant through Spinoza, a strange Spinoza who would turn in his grave if he knew he was being read as a spiritualist. The truth is that all these references are false, because they are deceptive. Brunswick may well have constantly invoked Kant, but he was not a critical philosopher. One has only to look at the astonishing melange he made of Plato, Descartes, Spinoza and Kant to see the direction in which he tended. Brunswick was a spiritualist who, like many of his peers, knew how to make use of the prestige of certain arguments taken from the most disparate philosophers, and how to distort them for his own purposes. In the battle that is philosophy, all the techniques of war, including looting and camouflage, are permissible. And when it was necessary no longer simply to comment on an author but to express an opinion about the facts of the history of the sciences, mathematics, causality and physics, Brunswick revealed his true colors. He too exploited the sciences to compose hymns to the human spirit, to the freedom of the spirit, to moral and aesthetic creation. The fact that he did not believe in a personal God changes nothing. This was a minor conflict between a religious philosopher and a spiritualist philosopher. Are other names necessary? When Paul Reiser writes a large book on psychoanalysis, Freud and philosophy, a scientific discipline yet again pays the price of a demonstration of freedom borrowed, this time, not from Descartes or Kant, but from Husserl. When someone like Garotti, who had his moment of power, claims to find in Marx's scientific work a notion of freedom, Marxism is a theory of historical initiative, a formula borrowed from Fichte. However Marxist and materialist he declares himself to be, he remains no less a spiritualist. Others who abuse Marx to present his theory as humanist, however Marxist and materialist they declare themselves, are no less spiritualist. Lenin would have called them chemin fached spiritualists, as this kind of spiritualism is hard to swallow and therefore hard to admit to. In every case, sciences, whether of nature, the unconscious, or history, are exploited by spiritualist philosophies for apologetic ends, to justify their objectives, no doubt because these objectives are so lacking in guarantees that they must fraudulently obtain one from the prestige of the sciences. As I said a moment ago, in the case of overtly religious philosophies it is the practical ideology of religion that, thanks to the good offices of these philosophies, exploits the sciences, their difficulties, problems, concepts or their existence, to its own ends. But in the case of spiritualist philosophies, I advance the following thesis: it is moral practical ideology. And this is verifiable in that all spiritualist philosophies culminate in a commentary on the good, in a morality, a wisdom that is nothing more than an exaltation of human freedom, whether contemplative or practical. Practice equals morality. In the exaltation of a creative freedom at once moral and aesthetic. At this highest level, the beautiful of aesthetic creation and the good of moral creation, or even religious creation, in the sense that religion is the highest form of morality, exchange their weapons and their charms with the blessing of human freedom and within its element. I am well aware that moral practical ideology poses a problem, for it is most often floating or drifting. Either it is a byproduct of social, economic, or political relations, for the Greek philosophers morality is a byproduct of political ideology, and is political. Or it is the byproduct of religious ideology, as in the Middle Ages. Or it is a byproduct of juridical ideology, in the bourgeois period. In each of these cases, morality is an ideological complement or supplement that depends upon another ideology. Let us not forget, as we have seen in some of our authors, that morality may also be linked to an aesthetic ideology. But this practical ideology is in itself, in certain periods and conjunctures, endowed with a kind of privilege that permits it, through its subordinate form, which is nevertheless regarded as autonomous and dominant, to express values that are difficult to defend, or at least difficult to defend in the name of an openly avowed practical ideology. To spell it out, when religion fails, it may be an advantage to be able to fall back upon morality. It makes no difference that the morality in question is bound up both with a declining religious ideology and with ascendant juridical ideology. To spell it out, when juridical ideology is too overt, and when espousing it might damage the cause you wish to defend, it may be an advantage to be able to fall back upon morality, its byproduct, and to treat it as if it had more to do with religion than with juridical ideology, or, if not religion, then the human spirit and its freedom. Brunchvich is typical of this latter case. He speaks of freedom, but this is not the freedom of juridical ideology. It is another freedom, the freedom of the human spirit, which he slips in under the juridical by speaking simply of morality. But we have not yet finished. For, in addition to religious philosophies and spiritualist philosophies, there remain the classical idealist philosophies from Descartes to Kant and Husserl, from rationalist idealism to critical idealism. As a first approximation, these philosophies may claim a very different relation to the sciences from the religious and spiritualist philosophies. In fact, from Descartes to Husserl by way of Kant, this idealism can claim a real knowledge of scientific problems and a position with regard to the sciences that seems to demarcate it from other philosophies. Descartes himself was a mathematician. He gave his name to certain discoveries and wrote on method. Kant denounced the imposture of sciences without an object, such as rational theology, rational psychology and rational cosmology. He took a close interest in problems of cosmology and of physics. In his metaphysical foundations of natural science he even inaugurated what would later be called epistemology. As for Husserl, we know that he was steeped in mathematics and mathematical logic. However, although in a different, infinitely less crude form, this rationalist and critical idealism claims to recognize the rights of science, it nonetheless exploits the sciences. In all its variants, philosophy appears to be the discipline that establishes the rights of the sciences, for it poses the question of rights and answers it by defining legal rights to scientific knowledge. This philosophy appears in every case as the juridical guarantee of both the rights and limits of science. It is not by chance that the question of knowledge, and the corresponding theory of knowledge, have come, this has in no way always been the case, to occupy the central place in philosophy. Who will guarantee me that the scientific truth I possess is beyond doubt, that I am not being deceived by a God who, like an evil demon, deceives me with the very obviousness of the presence of the true Descartes? Who will guarantee me that the conditions of experience give me the truth of experience itself? What then are the limits of any possible experience, Kant? What must be the modality of consciousness in order for the object that is given to it to be present in person, and what is this consciousness that is both my concrete consciousness and the consciousness of scientific ideality, Husserl? Although these questions seem preliminary, concerning only questions of right, allowing the sciences their autonomy, they involve philosophy in a theory of knowledge that unfailingly leads to a philosophy of science in which philosophy states the truth about science, the truth of science in a theory that relates science A human activity like any other, to the system of human activities in which, purely by coincidence, freedom is realized in morality, art, religion, and politics. It is necessary to unmask the subtle deceptions of this rationalist critical idealist procedure, which does not invoke the rights of science but asks science a question of right external to science in order to furnish its rightful qualifications, always from the outside. What is this exterior? Once again, a practical ideology. This time, juridical ideology. It might be said that the whole of bourgeois philosophy, or its great dominant representatives, for the subordinate tendencies that formulate religious or spiritualist philosophies behind the scenes must be given their due, is nothing more than a recapitulation of, and a philosophical commentary on, bourgeois juridical ideology. No one can contest the fact that the question of right, which opens up the royal road to the classical theory of knowledge, is relatively foreign to ancient philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics and the core of scholasticism. If there is an element of a theory of knowledge in these philosophies, it plays a subordinate and very different role to the role played by the theory of knowledge of classical bourgeois philosophy. It is hardly open to argument that this question of right at the heart of bourgeois philosophy itself is bound up with the domination of juridical ideology, although it is an unrecognized truth, unrecognized for good reasons. But that the theory of knowledge is entirely enclosed in the presupposition of this preliminary question, that the developments and therefore the results of this theory of knowledge are at bottom governed and contaminated by this presupposition of external origin, this is more difficult to concede. This, however, is something to reflect upon. It is not by chance that in response to the question of right, the classical theory of knowledge puts into play a category like that of the subject, from the Cartesian ego cogito to the Kantian transcendental subject to the concrete, transcendental subjects of Husserl. This category is simply a reproduction within the field of philosophy of the ideological notion of subject, itself taken from the juridical category of the legal subject. And the subject-object couple, the subject and its object, is merely a reflection within the philosophical field, and within a properly philosophical mode, of the juridical categories of the legal subject, owner of itself and of its goods, things. So with consciousness, it is owner of itself, self-consciousness, and of its goods, consciousness of its object, of its objects. Critical idealist philosophy resolves this duality of right in a philosophical theory of constitutive, of itself and of its object, consciousness. Husserl explains this theory of constitutive consciousness as intentional consciousness. Intentionality is the theory of the of, consciousness of self equals consciousness of its object. Only one of just like that, consciousness is sure of grasping itself when it grasps its object, and vice versa. Always the same need for a guarantee. I have given only a simple indication here, but it could easily be shown, by developing its logic, and by supporting it with all the connecting elements, that the demonstration is possible. If this is the case, we can understand why critical rationalist idealist philosophy subjects the sciences and scientific practice to a preliminary question that already contains the answer which it innocently claims to be seeking in the sciences. And because this answer, inscribed in the question of right, appears in law only because it appears elsewhere at the same time, in the entire structure of emerging bourgeois society and therefore in its ideology, in the practico-sthetico-religious values of this ideology, we can understand that what is being played out, in an apparently exclusive manner, in the little theater of the theory of knowledge, and of the epistemology of rationalist and critical philosophies, concerns very different debates. For Kant, the destiny of law, morality, religion and politics in the epoch of the French Revolution. For Husserl, the crisis of the European sciences, sic. To the first under imperialism. Of course, the sciences exploited by idealism once again bore the cost of the operation. The following points therefore emerge from this analysis. The vast majority of philosophies, be they religious, spiritualist or idealist, maintain the relation of exploitation with the sciences. Which means, the sciences are never seen for what they really are. Their existence, their limits, their growing pains, baptized crises or their mechanisms, as interpreted by the idealist categories of the most well-informed philosophies, are used from outside. They may be used crudely or subtly, but they are used to furnish arguments or guarantees for extra scientific values that the philosophies in question objectively serve through their own practice, their questions and their theories. These values pertain to practical ideologies, which play their own role in the social cohesion and social conflicts of class societies. Obviously, I am aware of the objection that cannot fail to come to mind, for scientists will readily agree with my remarks. What scientist has not felt the very particular impression created by philosophy in its relation to the sciences, even when it declares its sincerity and honesty, the impression of blackmail and exploitation? Philosophers obviously do not have this impression. Exploiters in general, and not simply in philosophy, never have the impression of being exploiters. And that does not make for easy relations between philosophers and scientists. But, and here is the objection, if every philosophy is, as has been shown, subordinate to certain values pertaining to practical ideologies, and if there is an almost organic link between philosophies and practical ideologies, in the name of what philosophy do we denounce this exploitation? Is the philosophy to which we adhere by chance an exception? Is it exempt from this link? Is it exempt from this dependency, and the shortcomings it implies, and is it therefore, and a priori, immune to the possibility that it might exploit the sciences? In all honesty, my answer must be that we cannot offer you an absolute guarantee. And I will add, if we were to offer you such a guarantee, after what has been said concerning the abusive, harmful and illusory function of the search for a philosophical guarantee, it would be, in our eyes at least, suspect. Instead, we will offer you two means of control. First, we offer the practice of our philosophy. The same scientists who are capable of feeling from experience whether or not a given philosophy is treating the sciences in cavalier fashion, or abusing or exploiting the sciences, will be able to tell if we are exploiting the sciences or if, on the contrary, we are serving them in our philosophical practice. This is a de facto argument. And here is a de jure argument. It is true that all the great philosophical currents we have briefly analyzed are subordinated to the values of the practical ideologies which exist in a conjuncture, to the values, let us say, of the dominant ideology, and, beneath it, the dominated ideologies. Let us go even further. It is highly probable that every philosophy, even if it is not religious, spiritualist or idealist, maintains an organic relation with the values of some practical ideology, with the values in question in the ideological struggle, which takes place against the backdrop of the class struggle, which implies that materialist philosophies, of which we have not spoken, obey the same law themselves. Even if they do not exploit the sciences to prove the existence of God or to shore up great moral and aesthetic values, even if they are devoted, as they most certainly are, to a materialist defense of the sciences, they are not without a relation to a practical ideology. Usually political ideology, even if, as in the Enlightenment of the 18th century, it is highly contaminated with juridico-moral ideology. We must go that far. But it is necessary to go a lot further. For if this dependence of philosophy on practical ideologies and their conflicts is recognized, why should philosophy passively submit to dependence on these realities, practical ideologies, without being able to produce a knowledge both of the nature and of the mechanism of these realities? Now it so happens that the principles of this knowledge were furnished by Marx in historical materialism, and that this knowledge transformed the old materialism into a new materialism, dialectical materialism. To the first it has been seen that the philosophy to which we adhere, or, more exactly, the position we occupy in philosophy, is not unrelated to politics, to a certain politics, to Lenin's politics, so much so that Lenin's political formulae were of use to us in stating our theses on philosophy. There is no contradiction here. This politics is the politics of the workers' movement, and its theory comes from Marx, just as the knowledge of practical ideologies that finally permits philosophy to control and criticize its organic link with practical ideology, and therefore to rectify the effects of this link by taking a correct line, comes from Marx. In the absence of an absolute guarantee, something that does not exist except in idealist philosophy, and we know what to think of that, here are the arguments that we can present. They are both practical, they can be judged by comparing the services which we can render the sciences, and theoretical, the critical check on the inevitable effects of ideology on philosophy through a knowledge of the mechanisms of ideology and ideological struggle, in particular, by a knowledge of their action on philosophy. To the spontaneous philosophy of scientists, SPS, we may now take up this second point. The meaning of the manufacture of new or true philosophies of science by scientists in the grip of a scientific crisis will now perhaps be more readily understood. Insofar as they simply adopt spiritualist or idealist themes that have been worked upon for centuries in the history of philosophy, they too take their place, even though they are scientists, in the long tradition of those who exploit the sciences for apologetic ends, and naturally without the counterweight of materialism and without the critical checks that can be ensured, within materialism, by knowledge of the mechanism of ideology and the class conflicts within it. But at the same time we can also understand something else, what we have described as the reaction of those stubborn and silent hard-working scientists who, even in the midst of the pseudo-crisis, obstinately pursue their work and defend it with arguments, always the same arguments, that the great philosophers of the crisis call naive and materialist. We have spoken very little of this type of scientist, the first reaction. However, Lenin, who violently attacked other scientists, defended them by evoking their materialist instinct. These scientists never proclaimed that matter had disappeared. They thought that it continued to exist and that physical science does indeed produce a knowledge of the laws of matter. These scientists have no need of a neocritical philosophy to revitalize their idea of science and of the conditions of possibility of scientific knowledge. They have no need of a philosophy to guarantee that their knowledges are truly knowledges, that is, objective, in a double sense, knowledge of its object and knowledge valid outside of any subjectivity. They defend themselves as best they can. Their arguments may seem simple or even crude to their adversaries. They may even be mistaken in their idea as to how to resolve the contradictions of modern physics, but who is guaranteed not to err? They represent a very different position to that of their peers, who are in the grip of the philosophy they profess. Their existence is important for us. For if we want to speak of the spontaneous philosophy of scientists in all its breadth and its contradiction, we must take into account both extremes, not only the scientists who construct a philosophy that exploits the difficulties of science, but also those scientists who obstinately fight, at considerable personal risk, on the basis of very different positions. I will cut short these indispensable analyses in order to justify the details of the exposition and get down to basics. 1. By looking at the elements furnished by the experience of a crisis in a science, we have come to the conclusion that there exists a relation between philosophy and the sciences, and that this first relation may be revealed in the work of scientists themselves in so far as they are bearers of what I have termed the spontaneous philosophy of scientists, SPS. 2. We understand this term, SPS, in a very strict and limited sense. By SPS we understand not the set of ideas that scientists have about the world, that is, their worldview, but only the ideas that they have, consciously or unconsciously, concerning their scientific practice and science. 3. We therefore rigorously distinguish between 1. The spontaneous philosophy of scientists and 2. Scientists' worldviews. These two realities are united by profound ties, but they can and must be distinguished. Later, we will examine the notion of worldview. The SPS bears only on the ideas, conscious or unconscious, that scientists have of the scientific practice of the sciences and of science. 4. If the content of the SPS is analyzed, the following fact may be registered: we are still at the level of empirical analysis. The content of the SPS is contradictory. The contradiction exists between two elements that may be distinguished and identified in the following manner: A. An element of internal, intra-scientific origin which we shall call element 1. In its most diffuse form, this element represents convictions or beliefs stemming from the experience of scientific practice itself in its everyday immediacy. It is spontaneous. If it is elaborated philosophically, this element can naturally take the form of theses. These convictions theses are of a materialist and objectivist character. They can be broken down as follows: 1. Belief in the real, external and material existence of the object of the scientific knowledge. 2. Belief in the existence and objectivity of the scientific knowledges that permit knowledge of this object. 3. Belief in the correctness and efficacy of the procedures of scientific experimentation, or scientific method, capable of producing scientific knowledge. What characterizes the corpus of these convictions theses is that they allow no room for the philosophical doubt that calls into question the validity of scientific practice. That they avoid what we have called the question of right, the question of the right to existence of the object of knowledge of that object, and of scientific method. b. An element of external, extra-scientific origin which we shall call element 2. In its most diffuse form, this element 2 represents a certain number of convictions or beliefs that can be elaborated in philosophical theses. It is, of course, related to scientific practice itself, but does not originate in it. On the contrary, it is a reflection on scientific practice by means of philosophical theses elaborated outside this practice by the religious, spiritualist or idealist critical philosophies of science manufactured by philosophers or scientists. It is characteristic of the convictions theses of element 2 that they should subordinate the experience of scientific practice to theses, and therefore to values or instances, that are external to it and which, by exploiting the sciences, uncritically serve a certain number of objectives pertaining to practical ideologies. In appearance, they are as spontaneous as the first set. In fact, they are highly elaborated and can be considered spontaneous only because their dominance makes them immediately obvious. To speak only of this case, in the nuance of their formulation they bear the trace of the question of right, which can take many forms, a calling into question of the external material existence of the object, replaced by experience or experiment. A calling into question of the objectivity of scientific knowledges and of theory, replaced by models. A calling into question of scientific method, replaced by techniques of validation. Or an emphasis on the value of science, the scientific spirit, its exemplary critical virtue, etc. Having identified what is at stake in the conflict between scientists caught up in a pseudo-crisis of science, and it is manifestly materialism, we can reasonably call element 1 the materialist element and element 2 the idealist element, in the generic sense of the three philosophies, religious, spiritualist and critical, that we have rapidly examined. 5. In the spontaneous philosophy of scientists, SPS, the materialist element 1 is, in the vast majority of cases, dominated by element 2, and the exceptions are therefore all the more noteworthy. This situation reproduces in the heart of the SPS the philosophical balance of power that exists between materialism and idealism in the world in which scientists known to us live, and the domination of idealism over materialism. To the first squared nothing is less obvious than this last fact. And even if scientists are fairly knowledgeable about the nature of philosophy, about the internal conflicts played out within it, and the way in which they are related to the great political and ideological struggles of this world, were they to recognize that in social, political, ideological, moral, etc. terms, materialism is in fact massively dominated by idealism, which reproduces on the theoretical plane the domination of the exploited classes by the exploiting classes, they would be reluctant to admit that the same balance of power exists within their own SPS. And so we must try to demonstrate it to them. It would take an extended theoretical and historical analysis to do so properly. Here again, however, given the lack of time, we must restrict ourselves to the production of simple empirical facts to make this decisive reality visible. But even assuming that we can make it visible, I should not conceal the difficulty of the task. It is difficult because we must work here in the element of spontaneity, that is, in the forms of representation that are given in an immediate obviousness which it will be necessary to break through or get around. And nothing is more difficult to break through or get around than the obvious. Consider, for example, what happens between you, who are scientists, and me, a philosopher. When a philosopher speaks, as I am doing, of element 1 of the SPS by calling it intrascientific, he will easily be understood, for the majority of scientists do not doubt the existence of their object, the objectivity of their findings, knowledges, or the efficacy of their method. But if he calls element 1 materialist, he will not be understood by all scientists. Some will understand, modern specialists in the earth sciences, naturalists, zoologists, biologists, physiologists, etc. For all these scientists, the words matter, materialism, and the adjective materialist express something essential about their convictions as to their scientific practice. For them these words are correct. But if we turn to other disciplines, things change considerably. Leaving aside mathematicians, certain of whom even wonder whether their object exists, and, with some exceptions, specialists in the human sciences, the majority of whom would not admit to being materialists, let us consider two sciences that do in fact deal with matter, physics and chemistry. When it comes to talking about themselves, physicists and chemists are very modest and reserved. I will therefore attempt to speak on their behalf, and they will tell me later whether I was correct or not. And if we were now to tell physicists and chemists that they have a spontaneous philosophy of scientists, which is contradictory and contains both an intra-scientific element and an extra-scientific element, the one originating in their practice, the other imported from the outside, they would not deny it. They would not find that improbable. But when they are told that element 1, intra-scientific, is of a materialist character, and especially when it is explained that this element has as its kernel the unity of three terms, an external object with a material existence, objective scientific knowledges or theories, scientific method, or, more schematically, object theory method, they have the impression of hearing not a scandalous language but a language that sounds foreign to them, that has nothing to do with the content of their own experience. This means that, to them, things are spontaneously presented in other terms. And if they were asked to speak for themselves, the odds are that they would replace the little group object theory method with another, much more modern little group, in which it would be a question of experimental data, of models, and of techniques of validation, or, more schematically, experiment / models techniques. This does not seem like much. After all, words are just words. If we wish to change them, we have only to establish the right convention. But unfortunately, we are not free to establish our own conventions in these matters, nor are words substituted for one another without a reason. To take only one little word, perfectly innocent in appearance, experience, or experiential data. It has to be made known that this word has expelled another word from the place which it occupies in the second group, a materially existing external object. It is for this purpose that Kant put it in power against materialism, and that it was returned to power by the empirio-critical philosophy of which we have spoken. When experience, which is, note well, something very different from experimentation, is promoted to the highest position, and when one speaks of models instead of theory, we are not simply changing two words, a slippage of meaning is provoked, or better, one meaning is obscured by another, and the first materialist meaning disappears under the second idealist meaning. It is in this equivocation, imperceptible to most physicists and chemists, that the domination of element 2 over element 1 is achieved in their SPS, which proves that it is not enough for a science to work with matter for its practitioners to recognize themselves as materialists. Which also proves, in fact, that a strange dialectic is in play between the two elements of the SPS, since one of these elements can obscure the other to the extent of making it disappear entirely, whilst claiming that it is merely giving an account of the same practice. However that may be, and to restrict discussion to the domination provoked by this slippage of meaning, it has not always existed in the history of physics and chemistry or any of the experimentalist sciences that think their practice in terms of experiment model technique. 100 years ago, physicists and chemists employed a very different language to speak of their practice, a language close to that used today by earth scientists and life scientists. If our scientific friends took the time to study the history of their discipline and of their own predecessors' representation of it, they would find interesting documents proving how, and under what influences, this slippage in the terminology of their SPS occurred, resulting in the domination of the extra-scientific element 2 over the intrascientific element 1. It may be concluded from this that to understand the content of an SPS, it is indispensable to return to the history of the sciences and to the history of the spontaneous philosophies, which simultaneously depend upon the history of the sciences and on the history of philosophy. But let us attempt once again to make palpable the fact of this domination by means of another, inverse example. If we recognize the existence of these two contradictory elements in the SPS and the dominance of element 2 over element 1, and if we know that element 2 is organically linked to the philosophies which exploit the sciences to apologetic ends, for the benefit of the values of practical ideologies that are neither known nor criticized, it is clear that it is in the interests of scientists to transform their SPS in a critical manner, to dispel the illusions contained in element 2, and to change the existing balance of power so as to place the intra-scientific and materialist element 1 in a position of dominance. But if it is obviously in their interests to do so, it is also obvious from experience that it is practically impossible, except perhaps in borderline cases, which would have to be studied separately, for the internal play of the SPS alone to bring about a shift in the balance of power within that SPS or a critical transformation of that SPS. To put it another way, in the most general situation in which element 2 dominates element 1, it is impossible to reverse the balance of power without external support. The domination of element 1 by element 2 cannot be overturned simply through an internal critical confrontation. As a general rule, the SPS is incapable of criticizing itself through the play of its internal content alone. What might this external support be? This external force capable of changing the balance of power within the SPS? First, it can only be a force of the same nature as the forces that are in contention, a philosophical force. But not just any philosophical force, a force capable of criticizing and dispelling the idealist illusions of element 2 by basing itself on element 1. Therefore a philosophical force related to the philosophical force of element 1, that is, a materialist philosophical force which, instead of exploiting, respects and serves scientific practice. Scientists are perfectly well aware that this is a matter of philosophy, of the philosophical balance of power, and therefore, in the last instance, of philosophical struggle. If they know something of their past, they know perfectly well, for example, that the experimental sciences of the 18th century received considerable help from materialist philosophers. And under the umbrella of the great and glorious history of the Enlightenment they know the stakes of the struggle in the representations which the men of this time, priests and their intellectuals on one side, the materialist encyclopedists on the other, formed of the sciences and of scientific practice. It was a matter of freeing minds from a false representation of science and knowledge, and of bringing about the triumph over it of a correct or more correct representation. It was a matter of struggling to transform the existing SPS, and in this struggle to change the balance of power, the scientists needed philosophers and relied upon them. Of course, things do not always happen in broad daylight. But just as our crisis in science revealed to us the philosopher dormant in every scientist, so the open alliance of the scientists and philosophers of the Enlightenment, under the slogan of materialism, shows us the condition without which the balance of power between element 2 and element 1 within the SPS cannot be shifted. This condition is the alliance of scientists with materialist philosophy, which brings to scientists the extra forces needed so to reinforce the materialist element as to dispel the religious idealist illusions that dominated their SPS. The circumstances were no doubt exceptional, but there again they have the advantage of showing us in bold print what, in the normal course of things, is writ small in tiny or illegible letters. And since we are speaking of this grand alliance between materialist philosophy and the scientists of the 18th century, why not recall that slogan under which this alliance was sealed? Materialism was brought to the scientists by philosophers who wanted to serve them and who on the whole, despite the shortcomings of this materialism, mechanism, etc., served them well. But at the same time, to dwell on this example for a moment, it is also necessary to take stock of the objective limits of this alliance. For the materialism that thus came to the aid of the sciences and scientists protected them, above all, from religious power and imposture. The historical line of demarcation of this time was a line between a religious knowledge that was no more than dogma and obscurantism, and sought to govern all the world's knowledge, and a scientific knowledge that was open and free in the face of the infinite which it discovered in the mechanism of things. But this materialism was itself subject to the domination of another idealism because of its own representation of the truth, a juridical, moral and political idealism. It is not by chance that the materialism of the 18th century was also the materialism of the century of the Enlightenment. In the great symbol of enlightenment, which the German language renders more explicitly as Aufklärung, enlightenment, illumination, very different from the mysticism of Illuminism, the scientists and philosophers of this time themselves were also living a great illusion, that of the historical omnipotence of knowledge. An old tradition, stretching back centuries and linked no doubt to the power attributed, in the division of labor, to those who possessed knowledge, but there is no power of knowledge that is not bound up with power proper, exalting the omnipotence of knowledge over ignorance. Truth has only to appear for all shadows, errors and prejudices to vanish, just as the break of day drives away the shades of night. This thought has never ceased to haunt even modern scientists. In some corner of their mind they are certain that because they possess science and the experience of its practice, they possess exceptional truths, quite apart from the truth, which they do not doubt will one day be recognized and transform the world. They possess the virtues of its acquisition: honesty, rigor, purity and disinterestedness, which they are quite ready to fashion into an ethics. And they think that all this derives from their practice itself. And why should they not think so, given that in their practice they are honest and rigorous and pure and disinterested? These obviousnesses are the most difficult to overcome. For, to return to our detour through the 18th century, we may see as clearly as day, so to speak, that the conviction that scientific truth is omnipotent is closely bound up with something other than the sciences themselves, with the juridical, moral and political consciousness of the intellectuals of a rising class which is confident that it can take power thanks to the obviousness of truth and reason, and which has already put truth in power. In their Enlightenment philosophy, the scientists and philosophers of the 18th century, however materialist they may have been in their struggle against religion, were no less idealist in their conception of history. And their idealist conception of the omnipotence of scientific truth derives, in the last instance, from their historical, juridical, moral, political idealism. Those, such as Monod, who even today take up in other forms the same exemplary themes and are, as their predecessors once were, convinced that they are speaking solely of their own experience as scientists, are in fact speaking of something very different, of what is now, for understandable reasons, a bitter and disillusioned philosophy of history. They simply reflect it in connection with their scientific experience, and it is reflected in their experience. Why all these details? To come to the following conclusion: in the contradictory history of the materialism of the Enlightenment, we may see the conditions of a shift in the balance of power between element 1 and element 2 and the limits of that shift. The conditions, the materialism of the philosophers incontestably served the scientific practice of the times, by reinforcing element 1 against the religious impostures of element 2 that then dominated element 1. The scientists' alliance with materialism served the sciences. The limits, but at the same time, whilst it did modify the prior balance of power, the contradiction of the Enlightenment philosophers' materialism, they were idealists in history, in fact restored the former balance of power, by subordinating element 1, the materialist element, to a new element 2, to an idealist element. Yes, to a new element 2 which, thanks to the illusion of the omnipotence of truth, and therefore of scientific knowledge, could incorporate all the themes of the ruling empiricism of the day. If this analysis, which is barely an analysis at all, has any indicative value, it is that it verifies, this time in an inverted and, which is even more interesting, a contradictory way, our thesis on the domination of element 2 over element 1 and on the inability of an SPS to modify its internal balance of power, to criticize itself. For it goes without saying that the illusions of the philosophers and scientists of the Enlightenment have taken a beating from history. It was not their ideas that changed the world by reforming the understanding, by bringing reason to light, by bringing truth to power. It was the unenlightened popular peasant and plebeian masses when they rose up in rags during the Revolution. Just as it is not their enlightened representations of scientific practice that has always allowed the sciences to advance, but rather the thankless labor of certain practitioners who do make progress, sometimes because of these ideas, but often in spite of them, because of other ideas. The ruse of reason. If you are willing to bear with me, we will draw some conclusions from this episode. I hope, first of all, to have made it clear that the balance of power within an SPS cannot be changed through an immanent critique. There must be a counterforce, and that counterforce can only be philosophical and materialist. Further, I hope to have made it clear that neither the contradictory relation between the elements of the SPS, nor the materialist philosophy that may intervene in their conflict, is given from all eternity, and that they belong to a definite historical conjuncture. Coming into play are not only the state of the sciences, the scientific division of labor, relations between different sciences, and possibly the domination of one science over the others, imposing its own practice as the norm of scientific practice, etc., but also the state of the dominant SPS and the state of the existing philosophies, practical ideologies and class conflicts. If this historical reality, and its necessarily contradictory forms, are neglected, it is impossible to understand anything at all about the SPS and the conditions of its transformation. Finally, I hope to have shown that the materialist philosophy which can so strengthen the forces of element 1 as to transform in a critical manner the forces of element 2 must be other than the materialist philosophy that allied itself with the scientists of the 18th century against the church and religious philosophy and ideology. For this latter philosophy, materialist in one sense, was idealist in another, and the services it rendered the sciences on the one hand were paid for on the other by a restoration, in a new form, of the prior domination of idealism over materialism. If this is so, we may perhaps be able to define the conditions for a new alliance between scientists and a materialist philosophy that respects and serves scientific practice. 1. They cannot be general conditions, edifying statements such as, scientists need philosophy, but must be specific conditions which above all take into account the historical balance of power. It is not enough to recognize the existence within the SPS of two elements, and the contradiction between them. Nor even to identify one as materialist and the other as idealist. Nor, finally, to establish that as a general rule the second dominates the first. In every case we have to know the actual historical form of these two elements and their contradiction. For it is an observable fact that the form of the representation of scientific practice, the form of its contradiction, varies in history with the history of the sciences and the history of philosophy and, behind these two histories, with the history of political and ideological struggles that are ultimately reflected in these two elements. We therefore have to identify the actual historical form of the antagonism in the dominant SPS. I say dominant, for it is also a fact of experience. We encountered it when examining the position of scientists belonging to different branches of scientific knowledge, that there is no such thing as a single, unique form of the SPS in a determinate epoch. There are several, one of which is in a dominant position, while the others, which have enjoyed their moment of power, must submit, although continuing to exist in a subordinate position. Thus, the mechanistic rationalism dominant in the 17th century, the empiricist rationalism dominant in the 18th century, and then the positivism dominant in the 19th century, if I may be forgiven these very schematic indications, although dominated today by the logical, neo-positivist SPS, subsist and survive even in our conjuncture, and one opportunity is enough for them to return, in certain disciplines, to center stage. Thus, Cartesian mechanistic rationalism serves the SPS well in Chomsky's linguistics or in avant-garde biology. It will be understood that this enumeration does not in the least indicate a linear sequence. On the contrary, it is the trace of a conflict-ridden history in which different forms of the SPS clashed in protracted and harsh struggles, let us say, ways of thinking scientific practice, manners of posing scientific problems, problematics, and finally modes of resolving the theoretical contradictions of the history of the sciences. It is because this history is conflict-ridden that it is necessarily resolved by putting into power a new form of thought or a new SPS which, at a certain moment, begins to supplant those that preceded it. But if we must speak of a conflict-ridden history of the SPS, then every conjuncture, including our own, must be considered conflict-ridden. And because in philosophy a conflict is never definitively or absolutely settled, in order to see this conflict clearly it is not only necessary to recognize the forces present, it is also necessary to identify the tendential resolution of this conflict, to know where it has come from in order to know where it is going, to which taking of power it will lead. We must therefore take into consideration all the stratified forms of the SPS which subsist and intervene, directly or indirectly, in the conflict and the forms that occupy center stage, and we must discern which is really the ascendant force and through what contradictory process it clears a path to achieve domination. We shall see later what today's ascendant SPS is. Logical Neopositivism. 2. The conditions of an alliance between scientists and a new materialist philosophy must be particularly clear. I repeat that we are talking about an alliance through which materialist philosophy brings its support to element 1 of the SPS to help it struggle against element 2 of the SPS, to alter the balance of power, currently dominated by the idealism of element 2, in favor of element 1. Through this alliance, materialist philosophy is authorized to intervene in the SPS and only in the SPS. Which means that philosophy intervenes only in philosophy. It refrains from making any intervention in science proper, in its problems, in its practice. This does not imply that there is a radical separation between science, on the one hand, and philosophy, on the other. Or that science is a domain reserved for science alone. Rather, it means that the role of philosophical categories and even philosophical conceptions in science, a role of which we have not hitherto spoken, to the first cubed is exercised, among other forms, through the intermediary of the SPS, and that the philosophical intervention of which we speak here is an intervention by philosophy in philosophy. Again, it is a question of shifting the balance of power within the SPS, in such a way that scientific practice is no longer exploited by philosophy, but served by it. Now you will understand why we insist on the novel character of the materialist philosophy from which scientific practice may expect this service. For if it is to be able to serve scientific practice, this materialist philosophy must be prepared to combat all the forms of the idealist exploitation of the sciences. And if it is to be able to wage this combat en connaissance de cause, this philosophy must be capable of mastering through knowledge and criticism the organic link that binds it to the practical ideologies on which it, like any other philosophy, depends. We have seen under what conditions this critical control is possible, Only in the case of a materialist philosophy connected to the discoveries through which Marx opened up the way to knowledge of the mechanisms of ideological social relations, Lenin, and therefore a knowledge of the function of practical ideologies and their class antagonisms. But if this is the case, it will also be understood that it is not a question of simply applicating a ready-made philosophy to a determinate SPS. For even supposing that we are applying a ready-made philosophy, a philosophy that has been perfectly elaborated and has mastered all its categories, we ought not to expect a miracle. A balance of power is not reversed in an instant, and idealist illusions are not simply swept away. If we believed that, we would simply be reproducing, within a formally materialist philosophy, the essentials of the idealist conception of the Enlightenment, the omnipotence of the truth dissipating the shadows of error, we might well have a materialist philosophy. But this would not be a materialist practice of that materialist philosophy. It would mean forgetting that this affair is a matter of struggle. The alliance we propose cannot be reduced to a protocol agreement. Of course we should sign it and proclaim it. But thereafter everything remains to be done, the protracted and arduous labor, amounting to a battle, to win terrain from the enemy, to foil his tricks and foresee his counterattacks, the long and arduous struggle to confront the unforeseeable forms that emerge from the development of scientific practice itself, and of which the enemy will always know how to take advantage. When allies agree to unite their forces, they must realize that they are engaged in a common struggle which is at the same time an interminable struggle. And the struggle is all the more difficult in that we still live in a situation in which idealism is dominant within the consciousness of intellectuals and will be so for a long time to come, even after the revolution. Throughout our argument we have assumed that materialist philosophy is complete, and armed with well-prepared arguments. But this is not the case. The scientists to whom we have proposed this alliance must know the nature of the materialist philosophy with which they are allying themselves. If philosophy is a struggle, and if, in this struggle, it is idealist philosophy that is dominant, this inevitably means that dialectical materialist philosophy must itself be constituted in the struggle, and that in the course of this struggle it must gradually win its own positions against the enemy simply. In order to exist, to acquire the existence of a historical force. Just as materialist philosophy does not possess the truth about the sciences, so it does not claim to present itself as a completed truth. Of course, we are able to state a certain number of basic theses that begin to constitute a corpus of categories. And these theses are tested in the struggle against idealist theses. But they do not constitute a system as in the idealist philosophies, the system of a total and closed truth. If dialectical materialist philosophy is genuinely a weapon in theory, it must, on the basis of a minimum number of firm principles that assure its position, be mobile enough to take itself where battle calls and to be formed, that is, constituted, in the battle itself. Have scientists ever been offered such an alliance? It is truly unique, because it respects the sciences in their domain. Because it calls on philosophy's help only to intervene in the philosophy that exploits the sciences. Because, instead of promising a miracle, it calls for a struggle conducted en connaissance de cause, and a struggle without end. Because, rather than speaking of the intervention of a completed, finished philosophy. It warns that philosophy is constituted in its intervention. Have you ever heard of a philosophy so modest in the way it offers its services? And so we call upon you to join this alliance. We do not expect miracles from it, and we are not promising you the earth, for we know the world we live in, a world where all the important things, even those which concern the spontaneous philosophy of scientists, are not decided in the minds of intellectuals but in the class struggle and its effects. However, we may expect results from this alliance, both for the scientists that you are and for the philosophers we are. By inviting you to draw a line of demarcation in your SPS between element 1 and element 2, we are not acting as spectators or judges giving advice. By inviting you to form an alliance with dialectical materialist philosophy, we are not acting like elders who have the strength you need. For we apply the same rule to ourselves that we recommend to you. How? By drawing our own line of demarcation in philosophy. By occupying, within philosophy, positions that enable us to combat idealism. If you have followed us this far, it seems likely that you have been convinced that such is indeed our practice. From the very beginning we have been able to speak of philosophy only by occupying a definite position in philosophy. For in philosophy we cannot, like Rousseau's noble savage in the Discours sur l'origine et les fondements de l'inégalité parmi les hommes, occupy an empty corner of the forest. In philosophy every space is always already occupied. Within it, we can only hold a position against the adversary who already holds that position. This is not an easy task. It is a matter of words. We know that. And nothing could be more natural than hearing words. But these words are not arbitrary and, above all, they must hold together. Otherwise, they will flee in every direction and have no position or space of their own to hold. And that is what has happened here among us. At times you perhaps had the impression that we were delivering a speech prepared in advance, pedagogically, didactically, perhaps, but philosophically, no. In truth, what we have succeeded in saying to you was won through a protracted, sustained effort, a work of reflection that was at the same time a struggle. And if we have set you an example, so be it, it is your turn now. Appendix